The smoke of copal rises toward a sky that is not yet decided whether it will allow the sun to be born again. And atop the pyramid, under the uncertain light of dawn, a priest sinks his hand into the open chest of a man and extracts the still beating heart while thousands of people watch silently, not in horror, but with relief, because that sacrifice has just ensured that the world will continue to exist one more day. Thus began every morning in Tenochtitlan, the impossible city built on a lake that should not have been able to support anything heavier than a canoe. But before this metropolis existed, which would make European capitals seem primitive, before the temples that touched the clouds and the floating gardens that fed hundreds of thousands of people, there was a wandering people, despised, considered barbaric even by the humblest tribes of the Valley of Mexico. The Mexicas, as they called themselves before history knew them as Aztecs, arrived in the Valley of Mexico in the 13th century. They came from the north, from a mythical place called Aztlan, whose exact location has been lost in the mists of legend. They were nomads, landless warriors, guided by their god Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the south, the warlord who spoke to them through his priests and promised them a destiny of greatness that no one, seeing them arrive in tattered clothes and rudimentary weapons, could have imagined. The Valley of Mexico at that time was a complex mosaic of city-states, each with its own history, its own gods, its own ambitions. The Mexicas arrived late to a world already divided, already claimed. The best lands were occupied. Powerful lordships like the Tepanecs of Azcapotzalco or the Acoluas of Texcoco looked down on these newcomers. There was no place for them. They were not welcome. For decades they wandered the shores of the lake, taking work as mercenaries, cultivating marginal lands, enduring the scorn of peoples who considered themselves superior. Tradition holds that at one point they were so despised that the Lord of Culhuacan offered them an uninhabitable territory full of venomous snakes, hoping they would die there. The Mexicas not only survived, they ate the snakes. This detail, which might seem anecdotal, reveals something fundamental about the character that would forge an empire. The Mexicas transformed every obstacle into a resource, every humiliation into fuel for their determination. They were rejected because they had no noble lineage. So they invented one. They began marrying into families of established peoples, adopting their stories, rewriting their own past to link themselves to the Toltecs, the great lost civilization that everyone in Mesoamerica revered as the bearer of divine knowledge. But the true transformation came with a vision. Year after year, their priests sought the sign that Huitzilopochtli had promised, an eagle perched on a prickly pear cactus, devouring a snake. The prophecy said that wherever they saw that image, there they should found their city, and there they would become the most powerful people in the world. They found it in the most improbable place, a small island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, marshy, surrounded by salt water, apparently incapable of sustaining agriculture or significant construction. It was the year 1325. Any rational observer would have considered that choice madness. The Mexicas saw the hand of the gods. They began to build with what they had: mud, stones, reeds. They created chinampas, artificial islands made up of layers of vegetation and mud floating on the lake, but eventually anchored to the shallow bottom. On these platforms, they cultivated corn, beans, chilies, tomatoes, pumpkins. The system was so efficient it produced up to 4 harvests a year. Where there was no land, they created it. Where there were no resources, they invented them. During the first decades, Tenochtitlan was barely a group of huts, inhabited by poor warriors serving as mercenaries for more powerful lords. But with each generation, the city grew. It expanded literally, gaining land from the lake. And the Mexicas learned. They learned hydraulic engineering from the people of Texcoco. They learned architecture from the Tepanecs. They learned writing and astronomy from all the peoples of the valley. They were humble students of the civilizations that despised them, absorbing knowledge while patiently planning their rise. The turning point came with a man whose name resonates in history as the true architect of the Aztec Empire, Tlacaelel. He was not a Tlatoani, the title the Spaniards would translate as emperor, but he was something more powerful. He was the counselor, the philosopher, the strategist who served under 3 successive rulers and transformed the Mexicas from tributaries into conquerors. Tlacaelel was tall for his time, with a penetrating gaze, known for his prodigious memory and his ability to speak for hours without repeating himself, weaving arguments that turned the impossible into the inevitable. But his most important contribution was not military, but ideological. It was Tlacaelel who completely reformulated Mexican religion, who elevated Huitzilopochtli to the level of the great creator gods, who theologically justified the need for massive human sacrifices, who created the doctrine of the flower wars. According to this new theology that Tlacaelel helped systematize, the universe had been created and destroyed 4 times. They lived in the 5th sun, the 5th era of the world, and this sun was also destined to perish unless it was constantly fed with the most precious liquid of the universe, human blood. The gods had sacrificed their own blood to create humanity. Now, humanity had to reciprocate to keep the cosmos functioning. This was not a marginal or superstitious belief. It was a complete, coherent cosmology that explained how the universe worked and humanity's role in it. The sacrifices were not murders from the Mexica perspective. They were acts of cosmic responsibility. The sacrificed were not victims. They were messengers sent to accompany the sun on its night journey through the underworld, heroes who ensured the star would rise again.
Tlacaelel also did something extraordinary and almost unprecedented. He ordered the burning of ancient Mexica historical codices and rewrote history. He eliminated narratives that portrayed his people as wanderers and despised. He created a new version in which the Mexicas had always been the chosen people, direct descendants of the Toltecs, destined by the gods to rule the world. This blatant manipulation of written history would seem familiar to anyone in the 21st century who has seen how modern regimes rewrite their pasts.
But ideology alone does not build empires. Military power was needed, and that power came with the war against Azcapotzalco. The Tepanecs had dominated the valley for generations. The Mexicas paid tribute to their lord, Maxtla, a tyrant whose cruelty was legendary even in a time that was not exactly delicate. When Maxtla began making ever more humiliating demands, the Mexicas faced a decision: submit completely or rebel and probably be destroyed. It was Tlacaelel who convinced the young Tlatoani Itzcoatl to choose war. It was Tlacaelel who forged an alliance with Texcoco and Tlacopan, creating the Triple Alliance that would be the power structure of the Aztec Empire. And it was the brilliant General Moctezuma Ilhuitzamina, nephew of Itzcoatl, who led the troops that defeated Azcapotzalco in a campaign that surprised the entire valley. The victory transformed everything. Overnight, the Mexicas went from tributaries to conquerors. The riches of Azcapotzalco flowed to Tenochtitlan. The tribute they had once paid, they now received. An expansion began. Moctezuma Ilhuitzamina, whose name means the sky shooter, would become the first great emperor of the empire. He was a formidable warrior, but also a visionary administrator. Under his rule, Tenochtitlan ceased to be a city of huts and became a metropolis of stone. The great temple was built, the twin pyramid dedicated to Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, the god of rain. Palaces were erected, causeways connecting the island to the mainland were laid out. Imagine walking through Tenochtitlan at the height of its power, say, in the year 1515, just a few years before the Spaniards arrived. Dawn breaks over the lake, and the city emerges from the mist like a mirage. 4 great causeways, so wide that 8 horse riders can ride side by side, extend toward the cardinal points, connecting the island to the mainland. These causeways are engineering masterpieces, interrupted by wooden bridges that can be raised to allow canoes to pass or to defend the city from attacks. You enter via the Iztapalapa Causeway, the southern one. On both sides, Lake Texcoco stretches as far as the eye can see, but it is not an empty lake. Thousands of canoes sail in all directions, transporting goods, people, flowers, food. Some are small, manned by a single rower. Others are large barges carrying building stones or tree trunks brought from distant mountains. As you approach the city, the smells reach you. Kapal, the sacred incense that constantly burns in hundreds of temples. Flowers, because the Mexicas adored flowers and cultivated them in elaborate gardens. Food cooking in thousands of homes. And beneath all that, occasionally, the metallic smell of the morning sacrifice blood. You cross the final bridge and enter the city itself. The streets are impeccably clean. The Mexicas had hygiene standards that would have shamed European cities of the time. There were public sweepers, drainage systems, communal latrines. Heriberto Cortés, not a man prone to exaggeration in favor of peoples he considered pagans, would write in amazement about the cleanliness of Tenochtitlan, implicitly contrasting it with the filthy streets of Spanish cities where people threw their waste out the windows. Buildings rise on both sides. Mexica architecture was impressive for its scale and color. The walls were not the dull gray of the ruins we see today. They were covered with painted stucco in bright reds, intense blues, vivid yellows. Important temples and palaces were decorated with elaborate sculptures of gods, warriors, mythological animals. Some walls were inlaid with jade, turquoise, polished obsidian shining in the sun. You continue walking and reach the heart of the city, the great temple and the sacred precincts surrounding it. This space is a city within the city, a walled complex containing dozens of religious buildings, preschools, courts for the ritual ball game, houses of dignitaries. The great temple itself rises 60 meters above the plaza, an artificial mountain with 2 shrines on top, one for Huitzilopochtli, painted blood red, and another for Tlaloc, painted sky blue. If you are there on an important day of sacrifice, and there are many throughout the Mexica year, you will see endless processions climbing the 114 steps of the temple. Prisoners of war captured in military campaigns, mostly young, some almost children, others experienced warriors. They are not chained. Many seem to go voluntarily, even proudly. This confuses modern observers, but makes sense within the Mesoamerican cultural logic.
For a captured warrior, dying on the sacrificial stone was infinitely preferable to dying of old age. It guaranteed immortality, transformation into a companion of the sun. Mesoamerican cultures had concepts of death completely different from Christian or modern ones. The fate of the soul did not depend on how virtuously you lived, but on how you died. Warriors dead in battle or sacrifice accompanied the sun. Women who died in childbirth became goddesses. Common people went to Mictlan, a gray and tedious, but not torturous underworld.
At the top of the temple, the sacrifice is swift. 4 priests hold the prisoner on the sacrificial stone, bending his body backward to expose the chest. The 5th priest, who performs the act, uses an obsidian knife so sharp it can cut more cleanly than modern steel. An expert blow opens the chest. A trained hand extracts the heart in seconds. The body is pushed down the stairs, where it will be ritually dismembered, and parts of it will be consumed in an act of communion that the Spaniards would find terrifying, but the Mexicas considered sacred. How many people died like this? The numbers vary wildly depending on the source. Spanish chroniclers, interested in justifying the conquest by presenting the Aztecs as monsters, spoke of tens of thousands in single ceremonies. Mexica records suggest smaller but still significant numbers. Modern scholars estimate that during the dedication of the Great Temple in the year 1487, between 4,000 and 20,000 people were sacrificed over 4 days. Even the smaller number is incomprehensible to modern sensibility. But to understand the Mexicas, you must try to see this not with 21st century eyes, but with the logic of their cosmos. They genuinely believed that without these sacrifices, the sun would not rise, the universe would collapse, all life would end. They were not killing out of cruelty or sadism. They were fulfilling the most sacred of obligations, keeping the world in existence. This tension between civilizational beauty and ritual violence is what makes the Aztecs so fascinating and so difficult to understand. Because alongside these sacrifices that horrify us, they develop knowledge that amazes us. Leave the sacred precinct and walk toward the great market of Tlatelolco, the twin neighborhood of Tenochtitlan. This market is, according to Cortés and Bernal Díaz del Castillo, the soldier chronicler who accompanied the conquest, larger than any market in Spain. 60,000 people visit it daily. It is organized with a precision that reflects the orderly mind structuring everything in the Mexico world. There are separate sections for every type of merchandise. Here, live birds are sold, scarlet macaws brought from the tropical lowlands, eagles captured in the mountains, tiny hummingbirds raised in specialized gardens. Over there, jade is sold, classified by tone and quality. Further on, quetzal feathers, each worth more than its weight in gold, because the iridescent green of the quetzal cannot be replicated with any dye. There are sections for food, where you find not only the basics of corn, beans, and chilies, but elaborate delicacies. Tamales stuffed with turkey or deer meat, frothy chocolate drunk from painted gourds, roasted insects considered delicacies, more than 40 different varieties of tomato. There are sections for tools, for ceramics, for textiles, for weapons. And there are vendors of knowledge, scribes who, for a price, will draft petitions or register contracts using the complex Mexica writing system, a combination of pictographs and ideograms that could express abstract concepts with remarkable precision. Doctors who sell herbs and offer diagnoses, working with a knowledge of medicinal botany that in some ways surpassed that of Europeans of the time. The Mexicas used willow bark to relieve pain centuries before Europeans synthesized aspirin. They knew antiseptics, anesthetics, treatments for countless diseases. The market is supervised by judges who instantly arbitrate commercial disputes. The punishment for stealing or using false weights is death, carried out on the spot. This harshness ensures the market functions with extraordinary honesty. You can leave goods unattended and no one will touch them. A merchant's word is absolute because breaking it means death. Everything is regulated through a sophisticated barter system, although certain items function as quasi-currency. Cacao beans, small copper, axes, valuable bird feathers, standard-sized cotton blankets. The Mexicas had no minted coins, but their economy was complex, with specialized merchants called pochtecas, who traveled hundreds of kilometers, sometimes venturing into enemy territories disguised as locals, bringing exotic products and, as important as that, intelligence about peoples who would eventually be conquered. Now walk toward one of the palaces, the palace of Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, the 9th Tlatoani, who would rule when the Spaniards arrived, is so vast it houses 3,000 people just in its service staff. It has hundreds of rooms, gardens with fountains fed by the aqueduct, bringing fresh water from Chapultepec, a private zoo where Moctezuma kept animals from all over the empire, jaguars, pumas, wolves, venomous snakes in special pits, eagles in gigantic cages. There is an aviary so large it requires 300 caretakers. Moctezuma, like all nobles, wore elaborate feather headdresses, and these birds provided the material. But the aviary was not just practical. It was also a statement of power. Only someone with unimaginable resources could keep thousands of exotic birds simply to admire their beauty. Inside the palace are workshops where artisans worked jade, gold, feathers, creating objects of beauty that would bring tears of awe to the Spaniards when they saw them. Mexican goldsmiths mastered metallurgical techniques unknown to Europeans: lost wax casting, the precise alloying of gold and silver to create tumbaga, a metal of unique color. They did not forge metal weapons, a fact the Spaniards would exploit militarily, but they turned gold into art that aesthetically surpassed almost anything production in contemporary Europe. Moctezuma himself was a complex man, very different from the cowardly image some Spanish chroniclers painted. He was tall, thin, about 40 years old when Cortés arrived. He had been a formidable warrior in his youth, earning his position by merit on the battlefield. As Tlatoani, he was seen almost as a living god. No one could look him directly in the eyes. When he walked, servants laid blankets on the ground so his feet would not touch common earth. He ate alone, behind screens, served on plates, never used twice. But he was also a deeply superstitious man, obsessed with omens and prophecies. The years before Cortés's arrival had been full of disturbing signs: comets in the sky, the great temple burning spontaneously without apparent cause, fishermen bringing a bird with a mirror on its head, where Moctezuma saw visions of strange warriors riding giant deer. These omens, real or elaborated after the fact by chroniclers wanting to give a narrative sense to the disaster, tormented Moctezuma. There was also a prophecy, or perhaps another later invention, about the return of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, the civilizing god who, according to legend, had departed east, promising to return in a specific year of the Mexica calendar. The year of Cortés's arrival coincided. And Cortés arrived from the east, where Quetzalcoatl had disappeared.
Did Moctezuma really believe Cortés was Quetzalcoatl? Spanish chroniclers affirm this because it suited them to present their conquest as the fulfillment of indigenous prophecies, divine validation of their enterprise. Modern scholars doubt it. Moctezuma was too shrewd to confuse a strange Spanish conqueror with a god. But it is possible he believed Cortés was a messenger of Quetzalcoatl, or that his arrival was somehow linked with the cosmic order, and that uncertainty paralyzed his initial response.
But before the Spaniards' arrival, before the catastrophe, there were decades of indisputable splendor. The empire at its peak extended from the Pacific Ocean to the Gulf of Mexico, from the northern deserts to the jungles of Guatemala. It was not an empire in the Roman or Chinese sense, with direct administration of conquered territories. It was more a tributary network. Conquered peoples kept their local rulers, but had to pay regular tribute to Tenochtitlan. Corn, beans, cacao, cotton, gold, jade, feathers, jaguar skins. They also had to provide warriors when required. Mexica tribute records, depicted in meticulously painted codices, reveal the vastness of this system. Each tributary province had specific obligations. Coastal regions sent seashells, salt, dried fish. Highlands provided obsidian, wood, skins. Tropical jungles contributed cacao, vanilla, exotic bird feathers, jaguar skins. Everything flowed to Tenochtitlan, transforming it into the center of an economic network, integrating completely different ecosystems. But what really sustained this empire? It was not just military force, although the Mexica warriors were formidable. From childhood, Mexica males were trained for war. They attended the Calmecac if they were nobility, or the Telpachcoli if commoners, schools that taught not only combat, but history, religion, astronomy, poetry. Yes, poetry. The Mexicas greatly valued artistic expression. A good warrior also had to be able to compose verses, to appreciate the beauty of flowers and birdsong. The Mexica warrior fought not to kill, but to capture. A dead enemy in battle was wasteful. A captured enemy alive could be sacrificed, feeding the gods. Warriors advanced in rank according to how many prisoners they captured. Capturing 4 enemies made you an eagle or jaguar warrior, the military elites who wore elaborate feather or skin costumes, who had special privileges, who were respected and feared. Mexica weapons were effective within this paradigm. The macahuitl, a wooden sword with obsidian blades inset on the edges, could decapitate a horse with a single blow, according to Spanish witnesses. Obsidian, volcanic glass, can be sharpened to an atomic edge, sharper than modern surgical steel. But it is brittle, breaks easily, and the Mexicas did not develop metallurgy applied to weapons. This would be one reason for their eventual military defeat. But the empire was sustained by soft power as well as force. The Mexicas were masters of psychological warfare. The massive sacrifice ceremonies were not just religious acts. They were power spectacles designed to terrorize potential enemies. They invited lords of neighboring peoples to witness the sacrifices of thousands of prisoners, sending the implicit message, "This is what will happen to you if you rebel." They also used diplomacy, strategic marriages, co-optation of local elites. They rewarded loyalty with access to Tenochtitlan's markets, marriage alliances, military support against local enemies. They punished rebellion with calculated brutality. Rebellious towns were razed, their populations enslaved or massively sacrificed. And they cultivated something more subtle, a shared cultural identity. Nahuatl, the Mexica language, became the lingua franca of Mesoamerica. Mexica artistic styles were imitated. Their gods were incorporated into local pantheons. There was a sense, at least among elites, of belonging to a common civilizational sphere, though within that sphere, Tenochtitlan dominated. The Mexicas were also sophisticated astronomers. Their calendar was more accurate than the Julian calendar used by Europeans at the time. They had 2 interwoven calendars, the Xiuhpohualli, a solar calendar of 365 days, divided into 18 months of 20 days plus 5 unlucky days, and the Tonalpohualli, a ritual calendar of 260 days. Every 52 years, both calendars synchronized, marking the end of a cosmic cycle. The end of each 52-year cycle was terrifying. The Mexicas believed the world could end then. During the final days of the cycle, they extinguished all fires, destroyed their possessions, fasted. On the final night, priests climbed the hill of the star and waited for the Pleiades to cross the zenith of the sky. If the stars passed that point, the world would continue. Then they lit a new fire in the open chest of a sacrificed person, and that fire was taken to all temples and homes, renewing the cosmos. These rituals seem exotic, but are they really so different from the collective relief we feel when our own cyclical calendars renew each new year? When we celebrate the winter solstice, symbolically guaranteeing the sun's return, when we perform secular rituals to conjure cosmic fears that we rationally know are unfounded, but emotionally feel real. The Mexicas had mandatory schools for all children, a remarkable feature in a time when education in Europe was the exclusive privilege of nobles and clergy. They taught history through pictographic codices, astronomy by direct observation of the skies, mathematics using a vigesimal system, medicine using a pharmacopoeia of hundreds of plants whose properties had been carefully cataloged. They had hospitals, though not in the European sense of Christian charitable institutions. They were more specialized healing centers where doctors, mixing empirical knowledge with magical religious practices, treated diseases. They knew herbal medicine with astonishing depth. When Spaniards sent samples of Mexican medicinal plants to Europe, botanists were amazed by their variety and effectiveness.
The botanical gardens of Tenochtitlan, especially those of Chapultepec and Moctezuma's private gardens in Oaxtepec, contained thousands of plant species classified by medicinal, ritual, ornamental use. Specialized gardeners experimented with hybridization, transplanting species from one climate to another. concepts of biodiversity and ex situ conservation that we consider modern had surprising analogs in pre-Hispanic Mexico.
But what is the central mystery of the Aztecs? What question about them remains without a satisfactory answer? It is not how they built their empire. That we understand a combination of military genius, sophisticated social organization, in the exploitation of favorable historical circumstances. It is not why they practiced human sacrifices. That also makes sense within their cosmology, as disturbing as it seems to us. The real mystery is this: why did such a powerful, sophisticated, seemingly invincible empire collapse so completely in such a short time? When Hernán Cortés arrived on the coasts of Mexico in the year 1519, he brought with him 500 soldiers, 16 horses, some cannons, primitive arquebuses. He faced an empire of millions of inhabitants, with armies that could mobilize tens of thousands of trained warriors, with virtually unlimited resources, with centuries of military experience. In 2 years, that empire had fallen. Tenochtitlan was in ruins. Moctezuma was dead. Cuauhtémoc, the last Tlatoani, was captured. The Mexica civilization that took centuries to build had been destroyed so completely that even the exact memory of how things were before the conquest was largely lost. How did this happen? The easy answer is diseases. Smallpox reached Mexico before the Spaniards themselves, spreading from the Caribbean, where it had already devastated indigenous populations. In a society without previous immunity to Old World diseases, epidemics were apocalyptic. Millions died, entire peoples vanished, the social structure disintegrated. This is true, but not the whole truth. Smallpox alone would not have sufficed if the empire had been united. But it was not. The Mexicans had conquered through terror and tribute, not integration. Many subjected peoples hated them. When Cortés arrived, groups like the Totonacs, the Tlaxcaltecas, the Texcocans saw an opportunity. The Tlaxcaltecas are particularly crucial to understanding the conquest. They were fierce enemies of the Mexicas, never conquered despite being surrounded by territory controlled by the Triple Alliance. The Mexicas kept them unconquered deliberately, using Tlaxcala as a reserve of enemies for the Flower Wars, ritual battles designed to capture prisoners for sacrifices. Imagine being Tlaxcaltec. For generations, the Mexicas have used your people as human cattle, capturing your warriors to tear out their hearts atop their pyramids. A group of bearded foreigners arrives with weapons and animals you have never seen and offers you an alliance to destroy your oppressors. What do you choose? The Tlaxcaltecas chose to ally with Cortés. They provided thousands of warriors, knowledge of the terrain, intelligence about the political divisions of the Mexica Empire. Without the Tlaxcaltecas, Cortés would have been just another European adventurer, dead on some tropical beach, forgotten by history. But even with indigenous allies, even with diseases devastating Mexico cities, the conquest was neither inevitable nor easy. The Night of Sorrows, when the Mexicas expelled the Spaniards from Tenochtitlan, killing hundreds of them, showed that the Mexicas could militarily defeat the Europeans when fighting on their terms. Cortés himself nearly died that night, barely escaping while his soldiers were dragged to canoes to be sacrificed afterward. What finally destroyed Tenochtitlan was a siege. Cortés, learning from his initial failure, built brigantines, small cannon-armed boats, and controlled the lake. He isolated the city. He cut the aqueduct that brought fresh water. He blocked the causeways. And slowly, over months, while smallpox killed thousands inside the city, while hunger consumed survivors, while political divisions among the Mexicas over whether to negotiate or resist paralyzed an effective response, Tenochtitlan agonized. Cuauhtémoc, the last Tlatoani, was only 25 years old when he took command of a doomed city. He was Moctezuma's nephew, a young but already respected warrior. He rejected all offers of surrender. He organized the defense street by street, house by house. When he was finally captured trying to escape by canoe in disguise, he asked Cortez to kill him with the dagger the conqueror wore at his belt, preferring a quick death to the humiliation of capture. Cortez did not kill him then. He kept him prisoner for years, torturing him to extract information about hidden treasures, dragging him on later expeditions to Honduras. Finally, he executed him under murky circumstances, accusing him of plotting a rebellion. Cuauhtémoc died far from Tenochtitlan, hanged from a tree in the jungle, the last symbol of an empire that only existed in memory. When the Spaniards rebuilt Mexico City over the ruins of Tenochtitlan, they used stones from the Great Temple to build the Catholic cathedral. They burned the codices, except for some that survived hidden or in curious collectors' hands. They banned Mexica religion, the sacrifices, even the Nahuatl language in official contexts. They tried to completely erase the civilization they had conquered. They almost succeeded. Almost. But not completely. Because if you walk today through the Zócalo of Mexico City, that huge open space that is the heart of the capital, you are standing exactly where the central plaza of Tenochtitlan once was. Spanish engineers maintained the Mexica urban layout. The streets of the old city follow the canals the Mexicas built. If you visit the National Museum of Anthropology, you will see breathtakingly beautiful Mexica artifacts. The Aztec calendar, that 24-ton circular stone covered with intricate symbols representing the Mexica cosmos. The stone of Tizoc, which records in low relief the conquests of that Tlatoani. Turquoise masks worked with thousands of tiny pieces, sculptures of gods so vivid they almost seem to breathe. If you listen to people in the markets of Mexico, you will hear Nahuatl mixing with Spanish. Nahuatl words that passed into Spanish and from there into languages around the world. Tomato, chocolate, avocado, chile, coyote. Every time you eat chocolate or use tomato sauce, you touch the Aztec legacy. Chinampa agricultural methods are still used in Xochimilco, where tourists float in colorful trajineras among artificial islands that have been cultivated continuously for 600 years. Mexican medicinal techniques survive in traditional healers. Stories, transformed and Christianized, persist in folk dances, in Day of the Dead rituals that combine Catholicism with Mesoamerican cosmology. Genetically, most Mexicans descend more from Mexicas and other indigenous peoples than from Spaniards. Culturally, modern Mexico is mestizo, hybrid, impossible to understand without acknowledging both its indigenous roots and its colonial heritage. But what was irretrievably lost? What died so completely that we cannot even reconstruct it? The complete worldview, the nuances of theology, the lived experience of being Mexica, of walking through Tenochtitlan when it was the largest city in the Americas, of seeing the Great Temple when it was intact and painted, of participating in ceremonies that integrated the whole community in a religious experience utterly alien to modern sensibilities. The codices that survived are fragments. Most were destroyed. Those we have were created after the conquest, often by Christianized indigenous people documenting a world already disappearing, filtered through the trauma of conquest and evangelization. Spanish chroniclers like Bernardino de Sahagún made heroic efforts to document Mexica culture, but they did so from outside as foreign ethnographers. Their indigenous informants told them what they remembered, what they were willing to share, what could be translated into categories understandable to 16th century European minds. But the untranslatable, what only makes sense from inside the culture, that was lost. Mexica music was almost completely lost. We know they had instruments, drums, flutes, seashell trumpets. We have descriptions of ceremonies accompanied by music, but exactly how it sounded, what melodies they played, that is silence now. Part of their science was lost. The Spaniards considered indigenous knowledge as pagan superstition. They burned entire libraries of codices containing astronomical, medical, historical records accumulated over centuries. Some more enlightened friars tried to preserve this knowledge, but it was like trying to save an ocean with a cup. And the opportunity for genuine dialogue between civilizations was lost. The Spaniards came not to learn, but to conquer and convert. The Mexicas, initially willing to incorporate the foreigners into their world, faced men who did not want to be incorporated but dominate. What would have happened if the first contact had been different? If Europeans and Mesoamericans could have met as equals, traded ideas as well as goods, learned from each other instead of destroying? It is a counterfactual question, impossible to answer, but tempting to contemplate. The Mexicas were neither the noble savages some romantics imagine, nor the bloodthirsty demons the conquerors painted to justify the conquest. They were human, complex, contradictory. They built beautiful gardens and pyramids stained with blood. They composed poetry about the fleeting nature of life and tore out hearts to feed the sun. They developed precise calendars and believed the world had been destroyed 4 times. They were, in other words, exactly like all human civilizations, capable of greatness and horror, often simultaneously, creating beauty and destruction in proportions that defy simplistic moral judgments. Here in the 21st century, what can we learn from the Aztecs? Perhaps that civilizations, no matter how powerful they seem, are more fragile than we believe. Tenochtitlan seemed eternal, and it vanished in years. How many of our modern cities would survive a comparable collapse? How much of our knowledge, stored in digital formats requiring electricity and technology to access, would survive if that infrastructure disappeared? Perhaps that judging past cultures with modern values is easy, but intellectually lazy. Mexico's sacrifices horrify us, rightly so. But our descendants in 500 years will likely look at aspects of our civilization, things we consider normal, with similar horror. Be it how we treat animals, how we ignore suffering in distant countries, how we destroy ecosystems for momentary convenience. Perhaps that contact between civilizations can be catastrophic when one has immunological and technological advantages the other lacks. Old World diseases killed more indigenous people than all Spanish weapons combined. It was mostly unintentional, at least initially, but the result was genocide on a continental scale. Or perhaps that something in the essence of a culture can survive even almost total destruction. Modern Mexico is not the Aztec Empire, but it is not simply transplanted Spain either. It is something new, syncretic, forged by the traumatic clash of worlds. The Mexica gods were officially defeated, but Tonantzin became the Virgin of Guadalupe, preserving attributes of the Mother Goddess under a new name. The sacrifices ended, but the Day of the Dead continues celebrating a relationship with death that is more Mesoamerican than European. Standing before the ruins of the Great Temple today, in the heart of Mexico City, surrounded by colonial buildings and modern skyscrapers, is to experience the literal stratification of history. The Mexica stones below, the Spanish cathedral above, modern buildings mixing styles, all coexisting, no layer completely erasing the previous one.
The Aztecs built their impossible city on a lake, defying the logic of engineering because their gods told them to. And for 2 centuries, that impossible city worked, grew, dominated. Then it collapsed so completely that the conquerors who destroyed it wrote nostalgically about its beauty, preserving in their chronicles the memory of something they themselves had erased.
Were the Aztecs victims of their own worldview? Moctezuma, paralyzed by omens and prophecies, took too long to respond decisively to the Spanish threat. The dependence on the flower wars meant they kept powerful enemies like the Tlaxcaltecas unconquered, enemies who would become crucial allies of Cortés. The extreme centralization of power in Tenochtitlan meant that when the capital fell, the entire tribute system collapsed. But these mistakes are only obvious in hindsight. Within their own frame of reference, The Mexicas made rational decisions. The flower wars made religious and political sense. The omens were real to them, as real as economic data are to us. Judging them for not foreseeing consequences based on factors they could not know, like smallpox or Cortez's true intentions, is unfair. Perhaps the most disturbing question about the Aztecs is this: would they have survived anyway? Even without the Spanish conquest, was their system sustainable in the long term? The siestro, constant need for wars to capture prisoners for sacrifices, was generating enemies everywhere. The tribute burden on conquered peoples was heavy. The divisions between nobles and commoners deepened. There were internal tensions. No civilization lasts forever. The Romans fell. The Mayas collapsed centuries before the Aztecs, their cities abandoned to the jungle. The Incas were conquered by the same Spaniards a few decades later. Perhaps the Aztecs were destined to transform anyway, eventually conquered by some people yet to arise, or collapsing internally from their own contradictions. But that is speculation. What really happened is they found an enemy bearing something more lethal than weapons. Diseases for which they had no defenses, and an evangelical faith that considered their religion not a valid alternative, but a work of the devil to be eradicated. The survivors of the Mexican Empire, reduced by disease, dispossessed of their lands, forcibly converted to Christianity, adapted as best they could. Some became allies of the Spaniards, using their knowledge of language and culture to position themselves as intermediaries. Others secretly preserved their traditions, disguised under Christian symbols. Others simply forgot, because the trauma was too great, because survival required looking forward, not back. Think about this. When you visit Maya or Aztec ruins today, they are being excavated from the earth or jungle that covered them for centuries. They were forgotten so completely that even their descendants did not know exactly where they were. The Great Temple was rediscovered by accident in 1978 when workers from the electric company found a huge carved stone. They had been living on top of it for 400 years without knowing. How many Aztec secrets remain literally beneath the streets of Mexico City, inaccessible because modern buildings stand above? Every time a metro line is excavated, artifacts, walls, offerings appear. The ancient ghost city persists beneath the modern one. And in the Mexican collective psyche, the tension between indigenous and Spanish heritage remains real, complicated, sometimes painful. Mexico's War of Independence was fought under the banner of the Virgin of Guadalupe, a syncretic symbol. 20th century revolutionaries invoked both Cuauhtémoc and independence heroes. Indigenism, pride in pre-Hispanic heritage, coexists with mestizaje, the racial and cultural mixing that defines most Mexicans. The Aztecs are invoked as national symbols. Their eagle devouring a snake is on the Mexican flag. But they are also strangers, separated by centuries and worldviews. A modern Mexican can feel pride in the Aztecs as cultural ancestors, but also unease at practices like human sacrifice. It is complicated, nuanced, resisting simple narratives.
What would the Mexicas themselves have thought of modern Mexico? It is impossible to know. They would probably be horrified that their temples were destroyed, their gods forbidden. But they might also recognize continuities: the food, certain festivals, the special relationship with death, the Mexican tendency to celebrate the macabre in ways that confuse foreigners.
When you watch a Day of the Dead celebration, with altars covered with marigolds and sugar skulls, with families spending the night in cemeteries beside their loved ones' graves, you see something that did not exist in pre-Hispanic times, but is not purely European either. It is a new creation, born from the clash of worlds, bearing traces of both, but fundamentally different from either. The Aztecs, like all truly great civilizations, did not die completely. They transformed. They dispersed into genes, words, foods, ways of thinking about the world that their modern heirs do not even recognize as inheritance. Every time someone anywhere in the world eats a tomato, they are eating something the Mexicas domesticated. Every time someone drinks hot chocolate, they are consuming a drink the noble Mexicas considered sacred. Every time someone says coyote or avocado, they are uttering Nahua words. And beyond these tangible legacies, there is something more ethereal. Proof that civilizations can arise independently in different parts of the world, develop sophisticated complexity, create beauty and knowledge, all without contact with Europe or Asia. The Aztecs, like the Incas, like Mesoamerican civilizations in general, refute any notion that civilization is something unique to certain cultures or races. Humans build, humans create. Humans seek to understand the cosmos and their place in it. These are universal constants, manifested in infinitely diverse ways. The Mexicas answered eternal questions. Why does suffering exist? What happens after death? How to maintain social order in ways radically different from other cultures. Their answers were not primitive or backward. They were coherent within their own system, sophisticated in their implications. The tragedy is not that they had different answers. The tragedy is that dialogue between their answers and the Europeans never occurred on equal terms. It was violently interrupted by conquest, disease, cultural imposition. Imagine an alternate world where contact between the old and new worlds had been genuine exchange instead of conquest, where Mexica botanical knowledge had been systematically integrated with European knowledge, where their Chinampa agricultural techniques had been adapted to lakes in Europe, where their art, poetry, philosophy had been studied with the same seriousness as the Greeks or Romans. That world did not exist. The one that did saw one of the great civilizations of human history destroyed in years, its people decimated by disease, its culture suppressed, its knowledge burned. But fragments survived. And those fragments, now studied by archaeologists, historians, linguists, anthropologists, reveal a civilization worthy of being remembered not as savage nor as ideal, but as complex, contradictory, human. The Aztecs sacrificed humans on scales that horrify us. They also wrote poetry of moving beauty about life's fleeting nature, fading flowers, the inevitable arrival of death. They conquered brutally. They also educated all their children. They were fierce warriors. They were also gardeners who cared for plant species lovingly. They believed the sun needed blood to rise. They also measured its movement with precision that would astonish contemporary European astronomers. To hold all these contradictions simultaneously without resolving them into comfortable narratives of good or bad is difficult but necessary if we truly want to understand them. And perhaps understand ourselves, because our modern civilizations are equally contradictory when viewed honestly. So, what was the most important thing the Aztecs left behind? What is their true legacy? Perhaps it is simply proof of possibility, the demonstration that on an impossible lake with limited resources, a determined people can build something magnificent. That greatness does not require iron or gunpowder or horses. That civilizational complexity can flourish in contexts radically different from those known. Or perhaps their legacy is a question that remains unanswered. How many other civilizations, how many other ways of organizing societies, understanding the cosmos, creating beauty, were lost in conquests similar to those throughout history? How many alternative versions of being human were erased before we could learn from them? The Aztecs had their chance to shine for approximately 200 years from the founding of Tenochtitlan to the conquest. In that time, they built one of the largest cities in the world, an empire extending over hundreds of thousands of square kilometers, a body of knowledge about astronomy, botany, and medicine among the most advanced of their time. Then, they disappeared. Not completely, but irreversibly transformed, leaving behind ruins, fragments of codices, words scattered in modern languages, and endless questions about what they really were and what they might have become. If you could speak to a Mexica from the year 1500 at the exact moment before the conquest, when Tenochtitlan was at its peak and the future seemed infinite, what would you ask? How did they really understand the sacrifices? What did it feel like to walk their impossible city? Did they dream of the omens their Tlatoani reported? What do you think they would say about the world we built on the ruins of theirs?